Hi everyone and welcome. We are joined today by Alex Krainer, a very insightful market analyst and author. Yeah, welcome back to the program. I know my listeners are always very happy when I bring you back.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Good to be with you again, and I'm very grateful that the listeners are receptive to the message, whatever I can share.
I guess on the topic of message, I thought if we yeah perhaps can start with Iran as this is obviously the biggest crisis on the messaging. How are you interpreting the messaging these days from Washington? Because it's going a bit back and forth. First, we had Marco Rubio reassuring everyone America had nothing to do with this. Then it seemed that Trump was claiming ownership. Then it's not going very well, and now he's arguing we had nothing to do with this. It's a bit, yeah, it can be a bit disorganized, disorienting. How are you interpreting America's role and communication strategy here?
Well, so far, I think that the messaging from the Trump administration is pretty much typical for what we've gotten used to, the messaging from the Trump administration. But given that the circumstances are as grave as they are, this is, to say that it's appalling is to put it politely. There's obviously been a very elaborate deception played by the Trump administration. Uh, my initial impression was that Trump himself uh, engaged in collusion with the Israeli leadership uh, to attack Iran with the objective of regime changing Iran, taking down their leadership. So that's the way things appeared initially. I'm not 100% sure anymore that this is what happened, in fact, because, you know, the elaborate deception may have been targeted at Israel also. And so I think that we won't know until we know. And I think that the test of what really happened will come in a variety of ways. One is, will the United States join Iran? Will the United States join Israel's war against Iran now? If it doesn't, then maybe the trap was set for Israel, in fact. Another test will be how will the Russians and the Chinese react to this? Will they continue to treat Trump like a strategic partner? Or will they shut him out? The Russians for sure are going to be remain polite and humor him, but if Trump actually uh, colluded with Israel to attack Iran, then he's on the wrong side of history, 100%. So in that case, I think that the Russians and the Chinese will probably shut him out from their strategic development endeavors and projects, and might only humor him and his administration to keep, let's say, to keep the relationship at some kind of a polite level. Like divorced parents, they still have to talk to each other, but they're not necessarily allies. I think we'll see. The reason why I doubt the surface appearance of things is because this would have been so awful that, to deceive Iran in this manner is not only bad for US relations with Iran, it is very bad for US relations with everybody else. And when I say everybody else, primarily we're talking about Russia and China, but then, everybody's looking at this, the Indians, the Iranians, the Saudis, uh, everybody sees this. And, their conclusion would have to be, my God, we absolutely cannot deal with this administration. There's nothing to negotiate. They will, if we negotiate with them, if we make any constructive overtures, it'll be taken advantage of and against us. So the the cost in terms of shredded reputation is so exorbitant. It's very difficult for me to even believe that any of this happened, which is making me doubt that maybe maybe it's a double game deception, and maybe the trap was set against Israel and Israel's ultimate sponsors, which is the Western Empire, which is primarily the governing system of the City of London and its satellites, primarily Paris, Wall Street, and then others, junior partners. So I think that only we will only know with time. But the response the Israelis got from Iran was so effective, so overwhelming, and so devastating that the only way that Israel can now uh, hope to even turn this around is by going nuclear. But if they go nuclear, that's the end of Israel. There's no going back from there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in terms of the escalation, because it seems, yeah, less like, of course, it's possible that the Americans will contact the Iranians saying, listen, let's just stop this, the destruction, and yeah, essentially go into a ceasefire. Nothing is solved, but both sides walk away with a bloody nose. This is a possibility, but it seems more likely now that we're heading towards escalation. Now, there's many pathways, of course. It can be escalation that Iran would target military bases of countries which are colluding with Israel, then primarily the Americans. Uh, but it's also very likely, as you said, that escalation would come from the side which is losing under the current framework of the attacks, because Iran doesn't seem to have much of an incentive to to attack any American bases now, given that in this limiting it between Israel and Iran has put Iran in the driver's seat. But given that Israel and the US is now on the losing side, being humiliated, there seems to be two paths towards a dramatic escalation. One, as you suggested, is Israel reaches for the nuclear weapon, saying that this is an existential threat. We have to take out the terror regime. We can see the language coming down to justify it. The other path is the United States joining in on the war, which they seem to have pushed back against so far. But again, there's nothing consistent. They might change their minds in 20 minutes. So, well, how do you see this? What is your take on this? Do you see any other paths to escalation here?
No, and I think that even the United States joining in Israel's war against Iran, I don't see where it goes, Glenn, because there's only so much that the Americans can do. They cannot bring 3 million troops and land them anywhere near Iran for an invasion. They can bring their destroyers and aircraft carriers, but as we know, there's only so much fuel, so much aircraft, so many bombs, so many missiles that these vessels carry. Once they fire them off, that's it. I think that every destroyer carries about 100 of these, air surface to surface missile and a limited number of surface to air missiles. And once they fire them off, that's it. They have to haul back to port to, replenish the supplies. And so their ability to wage war on Iran is severely limited. While, we've seen the way Iranians have been able to strike back at Israel. They have planned this, and they have shown that they have planned it well, and they have been able to execute it well. Now, if I were sitting in the Pentagon and planning operations, I would think, well, they've probably also prepared plans to deal with our naval assets. And so there's a good chance if we engage in war with Iran that they will sink our ships and aircraft carriers. Not only that, they're probably going to wipe out all our military bases. And so what is the upside? There is, for the United States, there is no upside in this war, which is why I'm extremely perplexed about the conduct of the Trump administration, which then leads me to suspect that this was the trap for the empire, not for the Iranians, because it's just so mind-bogglingly stupid to from start to finish that you would have to think that there's a lunatic asylum in charge in Washington, or that this deception is something other than it appears at at first blush and at the surface appearances of things.
Yeah. Well, actually, a few hours before the surprise attack on Iran, well, I was on the program of Judge Napolitano, and he asked me what it makes sense of these movements in terms of, well, you can see something was going to happen. I expressed my severe doubt. I said, it's quite possible, but I doubted it because it seemed, as you said, to be so crazy, so absurd because. Um, the things they're saying about Iran in the media, they're weak. They're if first missile hit the Tehran, the people who are so oppressed will rise up and topple the regime. I mean, all of these things. I thought they can't possibly mean these things, and they must know about the missile capabilities of the Iranians. And so my assumption was, they couldn't be this mad, but but I'm wondering if often one looks for other hidden motives or something, but it
Yes.
might be possible no one's behind the wheel on this one, that they're just acting on almost impulses. There doesn't seem to be much reason going on. But if there is, what do you mean? Like you mentioned, this could be that they're conspiring against the empire. What are you thinking?
Okay. Yes. I think. Look, I think it's very important to always keep the big game context in mind. And this is as George Soros told us, it's a clash between two systems of governance. The open societies versus closed societies. And the Kurt Walker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, said it's between democracies and autocracies. And so, it's very important. This is very important as concept because it is actually true. It's a conflict between the Western oligarchic system of governance, which for centuries now has given rise to colonialism and imperialism and foreign conquest and permanent wars for centuries now. And then the rest of humanity who maybe want permanent peace and prosperity and good relations between nations. And so, the this this imperialistic approach to governing the world has been directed most recently from the City of London. Although, it's the same if you go back in time, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Roman Empire, they've all pretty much used the same model of governance. And that is, you have to impose your hegemony and you have to make sure that all the regimes that control resources that you wish to control, that they are your vassals. And so, if you approach the conflict from this logic, then you realize, first of all, the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Iran is the same conflict, basically, two different war theaters, but the same conflict. And then you realize that all the talk about nuclear weapons, Iran being sponsor of terror regime, whatever, the need for peace in the region, that all of those are false rationales for the war, and that in order for the Western Empire to be able to control that region, they need a regime change in Iran. So it's not enough for the Iranians to say, okay, we'll we'll stop our nuclear program altogether. We will commit not to have a nuclear bomb because they've already offered that. And then the Iranians have also said, why don't we make the whole region nuclear free zone? So, if peace was the objective, everybody in the West, including the United States and Israel, should have said, well, that's fantastic. Let's work on that. Let's everybody get rid of nuclear weapons and let's commit to not attacking one another. That's easy enough to accomplish. And then you have peace in the region. But if that were the objective, this would have been taken care of a very long time ago. But it's not. The objective is regime change in Iran because only then do you control the whole region, you have the hegemony, and then you control the region's resources as well. And so that's the objective of the game. And so the United States is being used as the military muscle of enforcement for the empire at its own cost. So we see that the United States economy has been depleted, its military has been severely weakened, it's been shredding its reputation and credibility around the world in order to do this. So the downside for the United States has been massive, and it's been extremely costly. While the upside, the benefits are accruing to, the banking interest in London, Paris, and on Wall Street primarily. We had an example just to make this concrete. So December 2024, uh, Syria is taken down. There's a regime change in Syria. Almost, well, yeah, the next month, no, February 2025, the new Syrian government gives like a $250 million contract to manage ports of Syria to a French conglomerate, CMA CGM, right? And the CME CGM immediately commits to investing $30 million into modernization of Syria's ports. So there you see already the the colonialist interests coming in. But they didn't hire an American company. They hired a French company, which tells you that the ultimate financial interests are, the Americans are going around like a dumb giant, uh, winning the wars, as they say, but losing the peace. And then they have this frustration about nation building because they say we always go in there, we take the regimes down, we destroy nations, but then we don't. There's no political follow through. We don't build on anything. We just end up withdrawing and leaving a mess behind. Well, that's almost by design because it's always these European, British, French, and other interests that are now, if you pay attention, you'll see that they are really very actively trying to reclaim their colonial interest to the full extent as it was during the 19th century. And so I would be very surprised if people in government in the United States were not aware of this. And if they are aware of this, you can only be on one side of this issue. You cannot, you cannot be a little bit pregnant. Either you're with them or you're not with them. And so if you're not with them, then there is absolutely no logic to support Israel because Israel is nothing but a colonial settler project aimed at controlling and defending the hegemony of Western interests in the Middle East. And now, if this wasn't clear until now it should be very obvious. So for the United States to join into that and to say, okay, we'll defend this imperial project at our cost to our military, to our servicemen, to our treasury, in order for the French and British and other multinational corporations to have control over this region's resources and their economies, that's just completely insane. And again, either somebody has to be staggeringly dumb, blind, and stupid to be pursuing this, or it's some kind of an elaborate deception aimed against the imperial interests. But we won't know that until we see how things play out. Again, if the United States joins in Israel's war against Iran, then I'm afraid that it's the stupid side that won over. If they avoid that war and if they continue to collaborate with China, with with Russia and other regional players in some kind of a constructive way, then I think that this was a trap set for Israel and Israel's sponsors.
Well, I guess Israel has been, well, not shied away from making it clear they wanted or needed United States participation if they're going to attack Iran. And now that they attacked and things are going wrong, they're, very openly pushing for the United States to join in, which is why it's interesting that, well, so far the United States has not, given that it would result in a disaster. But again, it could change. But it is interesting how wars have to be solved because the idea that they're to support and help Israel. Well, in his younger days, yeah, several years ago, Joe Biden he made this speech in the Senate where he made the point that if there was no Israel, we would have to create one because this is the America's power projection in the region. Now one can argue that since then they've become more of a burden, but I've seen some European powers still make this argument. I think the Germans were saying it that in this attack on Iran, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, which is a very strange comment to make when you're backing a war of aggression that is a surprise attack in the middle of negotiations. So it is you're kind of reaching for reaching very far there. Uh, but I think you're right on the regime change as well, because Trump was also asked, "What is, are you going to call for reducing the tensions?" And he said, "Well, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon." But this is, as you said, a very absurd argument because the Iran has already said they don't want to need a nuclear weapon, and if there was a negotiation, a deal to have intrusive inspections to ensure that they do not acquire nuclear weapons, this could be done. But the problem we often see comes at the other end, that is from the Americans. They always link this to other things. They say, yeah, we want a nuclear deal, but we also need to have then limits on Iranian ballistic missiles. Iran has to sever themselves from Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, whoever are part of the resistance. And of course, the new extreme demand is Iran is not allowed to have a civilian nuclear power program. So Israel can have nuclear weapons, but Iran cannot even have civilian nuclear power. It and to pack all of this under Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. It seems very deceptive. But this is still what's being sold to people though. Um, even in Europe, this is become a catchphrase. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapons. But this is not this is not really the
This
issue
is
at
not
hand
the,
though.
yeah, exactly. This is not the reason for war because, the if that were the reason for war, there wouldn't be any war. It's easy enough for the Iranians to say, well, we don't need a nuclear weapon. We don't want a nuclear weapon. And if you will make this, if you will help us make this region nuclear free, we're done. That's it. The objective is obviously a regime change in Iran because that's the only way that the Western powers can preserve their hegemony in the region and secure it for the long term. And so this is their objective. And it's, speaking of Germany that you mentioned, apparently a German aircraft over Syria accidentally turned on their transponder for a few minutes and then switched it off. But now we know that Germany has joined in the war to help. I think it was like a refueling aircraft, and so now we know that Germany is active there, defending Israel. And I also find it quite funny that nobody ever mentions that maybe Iran also has the right to defend itself. It's only Israel that seems to have the right to defend itself. It's really strange. But beyond what we see happening now, this will obviously have long-term consequences. Pakistan has said that if Israel or Western powers use nuclear weapons against Iran, that Pakistan will join the war and that they will launch a nuclear missile on Israel. Then, the impact of this conflict will have long-term consequences for Jordan, for Egypt, for Turkey, for Saudi Arabia, uh, and it'll be felt very much in Syria, and the situation will easily get out of hand. So, we're in for a crisis that will not be resolved so soon, and I just sincerely I don't see how the Western powers can reverse their loss of influence and hegemony over the region. I think everything is now turning against them. And let's not forget, um, Iran also has full support of Russia and China in this conflict.
Yeah, I thought I saw Chinese military flight uh, restocking something in Iran. Well, they turned off the transponders when they were getting closer to Iran, but there is something happening there, I think so. But that makes me also think about the wider implications of targeting Iran. That Iran has a very key role in this new Eurasian model being or a configuration taking place. That is, it's a very central node between this east and west on Eurasia, but also it's also the central node in the north-south, especially then the north-south international transportation corridor, the Russia, Iran, going down to India. But also in general, in Eurasia, it's become usually we focus on Russia and China, but Iran has been leaning more and more into this new Eurasian constellation. So I do think that this is almost, well, to some extent, seen as also an attack on this multipolar Eurasian model, which is appearing, and by yeah, t- taking out a key middle part. But to what extent do you think, besides sending weapons, do you think the Russians and Chinese would get involved in any more direct way?
Uh, I very much doubt that the Russians and the Iranians will send troops, for example, but they will provide probably extensive technical support, air defense systems, probably not surface to surface systems because, then that would make them belligerents. If you found fragments of Russian or Chinese missiles on the grounds where U.S. military bases used to be, they'll be very bad. And I don't think probably that the Iranians need that kind of help either. But probably, intelligence sharing, surveillance, air cover, air defenses. In that sense, I think that the Russians already have teams on the ground helping man radars and air defense systems. And from the Chinese, I'm not sure, but the Chinese, we've seen that they've sold some weapon systems, including aircraft, to Egypt. So that might be part of the package. They might be supplying them aircraft to counter Israeli aircraft coming over to Iranian airspaces. But beyond that, I'm not exactly sure what the support will be. It is important to know that um, Iran, sorry, China, as well as Russia, have now pretty much designated Iran as the anchor of the new security architecture for this region and for the Eurasian continent in general. So, defending the Iranian government now is a very high priority for both Russia and China. And so they will, we have information that last night Vladimir Putin called up Donald Trump. And according to Donald Trump, the call was very friendly. Putin congratulated Trump on his birthday and on 250th anniversary of U.S. Armed Forces and all this. It's all very nice. But I think that probably there was also a warning in that call, not to get involved, and that, Russia will probably uh, provide substantial support to Iranians, so not to dream that they can go and try to take down Iran militarily. Probably, a call to dissuade Trump um, from joining the war on the side of Israel. Or alternatively, I have to say this, uh, a call to exchange notes and coordinate action, because I still think that there's a possibility that uh, Trump is playing the Israelis. I think that's plausible.
It's extraordinary to me, though, how the Israelis have played the cards so poorly. Also with the Russians, the Russians and the Israelis, they used to have a something of a special bond, not just because the Soviets, liberating Auschwitz, and of course so many people from the Soviet Union migrating to Israel, but there's always been this, even when they're on opposite side of a conflict, there's always this still mutual respect and taking into account each other's interest. And yeah, I remember a few years ago I was at a conference with former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and he was also just going on. Oh yeah, we all learned some Russian phrases as kids, and how special, like how Russia was always a key part for the Israelis. But after how the Israelis contributed to the proxy war in Ukraine, this relationship is pretty much yeah, dead in the water almost now. Russia's really, it doesn't feel any more need to constrain itself in partnering with Iran. It doesn't want to alienate the Saudis and the Gulf states. That's still a constraint, but the Israelis, they don't seem to care very much anymore. Like I think they've had enough of how Israel began to ignore their interests. So it is extraordinary. If someone would have told me 10 years ago that the Russians would be leaning this heavily into Iran against Israel, it would have been
Yeah.
difficult to believe.
Yeah, exactly. I agree, Glenn. It seems almost it would have seemed unthinkable a few years ago. But I have to mention another thing here, because I do have a few friends in Israel who are not part of this, but it does appear that Israel has now been pretty much since the days of the COVID pandemic in a state of mass formation psychosis that has been fueled deliberately. I think there's this kind of madness that has gripped the country, and so they are. Uh, it's hard to explain, but about a year ago, I discussed this with a friend of mine who is a devout Muslim and who studies Jewish, Muslim, and Christian eschatology, And he explained to me something that I was very much surprised about. This seemed almost surreal. But then over time, it seems that it's very much real, that for part of the Israeli society, particularly the religious cohort, there's a part of their action are motivated by a messianic requirement for the redemption of Israel. Okay, so to explain, uh, the Jews during the Babylonian captivity, they were promised that there would be a Messiah who would return to Israel, to the Jews, right? And sorry, not to return, to come. There would come. A Messiah would come to the Jews, but before the Messiah can come, uh, Israel has to be, the collective Jewry have to be redeemed for their sins and their evil. And in order for them to be redeemed for their sins, they need to be punished. Okay. And in order, basically, the punishment is supposed to come in the form of the whole world turning against Israel and the Jews. And in order for that to happen, they have to basically engage in such blatant evildoing that it's absolutely obvious to everybody in this world, so that the whole world would turn against Israel. And then the punishment would come, and it would be very obvious. It kind of, the picture looks like what is happening now, like in places like Tel Aviv and Haifa. And I thought, well, I'm sure that there's some fanatics who actually think this, but I mean, come on. But then it turns out that actually, there's a very influential rabbi. His name is something Schneerson, who's very close to Benjamin Netanyahu. And apparently, Benjamin Netanyahu from time to time briefs Rabbi Schneerson as where are we at? Are we making progress towards this redemption of Israel? And Rabbi Schneerson actually declared that Benjamin Netanyahu would, and he's very influential actually in the religious circles in Israel. And he said that Benjamin Netanyahu would be the last leader of Israel before the return of the Messiah, and the date for redemption to be completed is some specific date, something like 2 September 2027. I'm not sure that it's 2 September, but it's some specific date in 2027. So by then, the redemption of Israel has to be completed, which means that they have to receive a very severe punishment from the whole rest of the world. And there really is apparently a very influential segment of religious Jews in Israel who actually believe that, and who are actually kind of lobbying and pushing the government and the IDF to make sure that these things happen. And so, to a part of them, this is real, which means that all of the rational thought that, you or I or the Russians or the Trump administration or the military people have, you think about upside and downside. What do we want to achieve? What is the potential benefit? What's the potential downside? And then you decide, well, okay, this course of action is not reasonable. It's too risky. It's too destructive. Well, to this cohort, all the better, because the worst the prospects from something, the more they want to do it. And it seems that they really do have their foot on the clutch of Israel's collective conduct.
I spoke not that long ago to an Israeli journalist, Gideon Levy. So he's yeah, quite prominent there in Israel, but also quite critical of the Netanyahu government, and also, by the way, their military actions in Gaza. And he explained it differently though. He saw it as well. I thought of him when you mentioned mass psychosis because that's more or less the direction he was taking it as well. He was saying that. The yeah the more the world criticizes them, the Israel, the more the people in Israel believes that, well, this confirms that the whole world is against them, and this only legitimizes more the need to take bold action and show no empathy, no mercy when they carry out their objectives, and so it becomes this weird cycle where the yeah, where the consequence of their actions will fuel even more aggressive action. So I can't remember if he used the word mass psychosis, but the way he described it, it certainly sounded like this. So the whole, I guess my point is that reason itself has been, yeah, left a lot of the decision making. Um,
Correct.
but on the absence of reason, though, we also assume on the United States part that they have a lot of, that they're calculating what is, how can they pursue this conflict or not. Of course, we know all about the Israeli lobby and all, but for the Trump himself, this is not an isolated case. As you mentioned, they have more things going on. They have riots and protests at home. They have an economic war with the Chinese. They have a proxy war in Ukraine against the Russians. He doesn't have that much room to maneuver necessarily if he does the wrong thing. The political class, the public, a lot of people can come against him, and I think I'm not sure how you see Trump's role in this. If we assume that he wants to help Israel destroy Iran, how much room of maneuver does he actually have?
Yeah, I think that he has very little room for maneuver, because the American society, I think that even though the opposition to Israel is now growing, and I think that it's quite widespread and robust by now, I still think that the people in the bowels of the administration, the all the cold warriors that have been there staffing the NSA and the CIA and the Pentagon and the U.S. Congress, importantly, they are still very much committed to Israel. They're still uh, cling to this sentimental attachment to think of Israel as a good thing. And then, of course, this sentimental attachment is always rewarded with some contributions from donors so that the whole thing is very strongly entrenched. And, as many observers said, Benjamin Netanyahu today has more control over the US Congress than Donald Trump does. So, what do you do? Uh, I think that you either have to engage in some kind of a very clever deception to run to let's say dissent from this in actual fact and avoid getting enmeshed in this war. Let's not forget Persia has traditionally been the graveyard of empires, and everybody who tried to take down this old civilization eventually lost their empire. So that's the that's the downside. I don't see the upside so much. Or else, if he doesn't engage in some kind of a clever 4D deception, then he has to go along with it, and then he has to own that war. He will absolutely, if he goes along with defending Israel, he will absolutely own that war, and he will own the consequences of that war, which will be devastating for the United States. In the end, they will be able to maybe launch nuclear missiles at Iran, which will probably have similar consequences like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, probably times 100, which means that the country will be devastated, but it will not be the end of it. It will be the end of the Western Empire and of the United States in that case. And I think that ultimately the political price that will be paid by the Trump administration will be essentially the destruction of his presidency, and you know, he will have no other choice but to basically be a stooge of these Western financial interests who are scheming to defend their hegemony over the Middle East. And I think that's such a poor choice. There's so little upside for the United States in that, and such vast downside. And I think that it's obvious enough that I have a very hard time with the notion that what we see happening is what is actually happening. And I think we'll only know for sure with time.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's my yeah, my point that the countries in decline or facing something existential, they will take great risks and act often irrationally. But we then look towards Israel, but the United States as a backer, it's also in a historically it's a very difficult spot as well. The you know the it's not easy to manage for Trump. He's a president of an empire in decline. Managing America's decline is not an ideal job to have. And of course, I think he came off at a very high after this election. He was the ultimate underdog. It was there was probably a lot of optimism there that he could actually pull off a lot of the things he wanted. That is, renegotiate or reorganize the world economy to America's favor. Win over the Russians, put them against the Chinese. End all this forever wars. It looked like he had a plan, but again, it must be hard to manage this decline of empire, and so I thought he attempted to reinvent empire. That is, get high return on investments, make sure that allies pay. But again, the plans, I think, are insufficient. Implementation has been terrible, and so many mistakes has been made. My concern is that almost in this American spirit, they're looking for this final showdown at the end, to turn it all around like some Hollywood plot almost. But it looks like this is the direction they're going. I'm just wondering if yeah, I guess as my last question, if we continue down this path where what we see happening now between Israel and Iran, where do you think this is going to go?
I think that ultimately it's going to go the way all empires go in history. You know, eventually the cost of maintaining an empire crushes the empire itself because in these imperial relations, it's always a very narrow segment of any society that benefits from the empire. You know, what in today's version would be the global systemically important banks and the global multinational corporations. While everybody else pays the bill because you know these all these hundreds of military bases around the world and all these carrier strike groups that are going around, they don't pay for themselves. It's the U.S. taxpayers and the U.S. Legitimate businesses that have to support this through taxes, right? And so, if you continue fielding the empire, if you continue policing the world against independence and liberty and emancipation from the empire, you're going to be shredding your economic base, your military base, your diplomatic base, and so it's going to go badly. And I think that in this at this point in time, it might go badly very fast and very dramatically because you know, let's not forget that the Western financial system and the partly that's the reason why the West is behaving so aggressively. The Western financial system is in a catastrophic state. It was already, if you rewind the clock about a year ago in 2024, Jamie Dimon wrote a letter to JP Morgan's shareholders in which he warned them that the imbalances that are present in the system are absolutely unprecedented, and that the crisis once the dam bursts is going to be of catastrophic proportions. And none of that happened yet. But after another year of warfare, after another year of supporting Project Ukraine, the wars in the Middle East, and standing on ever thinner ice, I think that when the fallout does happen, it's going to take us by surprise, and it's probably going to usher in a crisis that by magnitude will probably resemble the collapse of Weimar Republic in Germany 100 and some years ago. And so I think that this is now closer to us than we realize. And for the United States, the United States is the one country that has some maneuvering space. They could coast through the crisis, come out on the other side, um, reindustrialize, change the financial basis, change the monetary system, adopt a dual circulation dollar, one for like the Chinese, they have one, the renminbi for internal circulation and trade, and then they have another type currency for external trade, which helps protect China from external shocks. So that's an option for the United States to roll back the empire, to come back home, invest, allocate capital to small and medium-sized business, have constructive bilateral relations with countries like China and Russia, join the multipolar integrations process, BRICS, and let go of empire building nonsense. If you go back to 2016 and before that, and you look at Trump's positioning in terms of America's role in the world, you see that he's very consistently on that side. So what happened now? Has he been compromised? Has he lost his mind? Has he given up and decided, hey, I can't beat the empire. Maybe I'll just join them back again. It's early days to say, but I think that we will find out over the coming couple of months. I think that the crisis is inevitable, and I think that the crisis will come in the form of high inflation. But high inflation will sink Great Britain and Europe before it will sink the United States. And I think that the United States will probably be able to extricate itself. And after a period of crisis, which is inevitable, the United States will go back to being a strong regional power politically and a very strong economic power trading with the rest of the world. I think Europe is looking at a future that probably resembles the fall of the Western Roman Empire. I think it's going to be dark days, and until we throw off this European Union, NATO, European Central Bank matrix of control, and go back to managing individual sovereign countries, it's going to be dark days. But again, as soon as we do get rid of NATO, ECB, European Union, there's an alternative. There's now the Eastern option. We can make nice with the Russians, with the Chinese, join the multipolar integration, bring back, Vladimir Putin back in 2007 was already talking about global integrations from Lisbon to Vladivostok, which means why don't we all, trade together, cooperate together to everybody's benefit? And that remains an option for everyone.
Yeah, well, in this 2007 speech by Putin in Munich, which it was heavily condemned in the West, but he also made an interesting comment there saying that this unipolar world order, that is, one center should call all the shots. Not only was it intolerable for Russia, but he also made a point that for the empire itself, it would be very destructive because it would begin to exhaust itself. It would begin to corrupt its own institutions. So that was well, in my opinion, quite accurate if we see what's happened. But also the predictions by other like academics since the 1990s that if the US will pursue this global empire as yes, the format of New World Order, they would exhaust the resources. The rest of the world would balance them. So it does seem as if the remedy to this, how to fix it, would be to again take that, as you said, take that step back. Don't sacrifice the republic to save the empire, and by pulling back, they would be able to, I guess, recover some of their economic strength, and at the same time, the rest of the great powers wouldn't collectively balance the U.S. If the U.S. goes into a severe economic crisis now, it's gonna have a very difficult external environment. They pretty much declared the intention on trying to destroy the Chinese economy. They're fighting a proxy war against Russia, now against Iran. I mean, this is this could become a perfect storm for them. It's strange for me to see that other choices aren't being made. And I have to be honest, I was quite optimistic when Trump took over because by his language, he suggested more or less that this is what had to be done to because the current path wasn't sustainable. But as you said, it seems to be being captured by those um, by the status quo.
Um, yeah, I think that either he is or he's not. It's very hard to say, but the silver lining in your system collapsing at home as it is that you're going to be able to flush out a lot of these vested interests that now are defending the status quo. And it's not like there's a choice between that. You can either have a collapse sooner and try to manage it, or you're going to get a collapse later. You're going to get a collapse anyway, because the seeds of destruction of the system are baked in from the very get-go. The way the monetary system works, the crises are almost always present, either acutely or chronically. Western financial systems, they are, they usually go through a business cycle of expansion where everybody feels like things are good and the economy is doing well and everybody's feeling a little bit prosperous. But probably more than half the time they are in crises. And then, every time you do away with one crisis, the tails, the 2008 global financial crisis never resolved itself. They kind of shoved things under the carpet and carried on with further credit expansion. But, credit expansion is something that buys you some temporary prosperity, but at some point, the credit on the other side is debt. You have to pay back the debts, right? With interest, which means that a huge amount of liquidity is going to come out of the system, causing the system to seize up and grind down. And then the only way that the powers that be, the central banks and the people who control central banks can push away the crisis is by flooding the system with liquidity. Well, you can do this almost indefinitely, except that eventually you're going to have high levels of inflation and you're going to destroy the currency itself. So the destruction of the US dollar is pretty much baked in. It's inevitable. And I think that uh, that is one thing that I'm sure about. Trump and the people around him are very keenly aware of this. They know that the dollar is going down. Either is going to be happening more gradually farther away in time, or it's going to be happening sooner. And then maybe if you orchestrate an economic collapse sooner, you might want to do that if you have a plan for a succession for what comes next. Trump has been talking about changing the monetary base, the currency system. He's been talking about introducing a sovereign wealth fund for the United States. I think that a lot of these initiatives are actually what has prompted the other side, George Soros and these types of oligarchs acting behind the scenes to even orchestrate this No King's Day, you know, that the whole obsession with no kings is another thing that a book could be written about. But they're clearly trying to clip Trump's wings to disable him to effect a lot of these reforms that he has planned and that he has talked about, and some of them he hasn't talked about, but they were kind of insinuated in various statements by Bessent, by Trump, by others in his administration. So we'll see the outcome of the game, but we are going into a severe crisis. And then, I think that Trump's ability to prevail and to survive politically will in large part depend also on his ability to obtain support from Russia and from China. And right now, I think that he won politically some points because this whole thing with Israel, they I listened to Benjamin Netanyahu's statement where in order to encourage the United States to come to his aid, he has been profusely expressing profuse gratitude to Trump for his support. Well, now this gives Trump some, credit with these pro-Israel people where they can't say that Trump hasn't been supportive of Israel, because here's Benjamin Netanyahu himself saying how very supportive I have been. It's going to be very interesting, but I think that we really have to keep in mind the large context that this is a conflict between two systems of governance. And in that, it's potentially a break with 500 years of history of Western primacy, because this system that gave the West primacy has been the defining feature of Western civilization. And the United States was created as a rejection of this system, as an attempt to liberate humanity from it. In all his statements, Trump has been inclined to get the United States back to its Republican roots. Um, I think that this is much, much bigger than war in Ukraine, than support for Israel, war against Iran. And so I think that the outcome is far from clear. And I think that even Trump's role in this is far from clear. And just to finish, I want to mention another aspect of this. Trump is the guy we see, but Trump is not necessarily who's running the show. Because, the deeper you look into, the events within the United States, within the bowels of power, and the way American foreign policy is being decided and managed, you realize that the opposition to the empire in the United States is far more broad-based than just Trump. Even if you took Trump out of the picture, that opposition wouldn't just disappear. And so we will find out, but I think that one of the most important battlefields now is the United States itself. And I wouldn't be surprised if very, very elaborate, deception wrapped within another deception, with another layer of deception on top of it, weren't actually being played out. And again, we'll see how it happens, and what ends up happening in the real world.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, though, but a lot of these internal competitions in the US between, neoliberals, libertarians, some of the tech bros appears to be leaning a bit now towards the economic nationalism. I mean, there's a lot of different factions, and I think a lot of this does play into yeah, decisions such as what to do with Israel, Iran, and how the empire should yeah, how it should be managed or dismantled, because it is, I thought it's interesting what you said, that many people want, like Trump, to go back to its more Republican days. And it's worth remembering in the 19th century that the Americans actually had quite a resentment for the European empires, that indeed the United States, the whole, as you said, the whole purpose of the United States was not to be like Europe, but to offer a different kind of world, which didn't go with this imperialism. It's really in 1898, with the victory in the Spanish War, and America, pivoting into the Pacific, which made Mark Twain and a lot of other intellectuals in America say that this is a huge disaster. We're going down the route of the Europeans. We have to turn around. Maybe they will, but yeah, at the moment, this decision is being made in Iran, towards Iran. Yeah, indicate otherwise. Anyways, Alex, thank you, and yeah, I hope to have you back on soon, because uh, I'm guessing, yeah, there will be much more to speak about very shortly.
Oh
So
yes, for
thanks again.
sure. I think, the events are happening at breakneck speed. So we'll learn. I've these, as they say, wars are great revealers, and what has been happening of late has been, deep learning experiences. Trying to explain the events is very difficult, and obviously about much of it we're not doing more than educated guessing. But at the same time, there is much to learn. And I think that we will find out a lot more over the coming days and weeks. And I have to say, I remain cautiously optimistic, because the stakes in the game are much, much bigger even than Trump. His political career is maybe a very small part of this whole equation. And anyway, he has another 3.5 years more or less to go. So I think that there are powerful forces in the United States gathering in opposition to the Western Empire. They have allies in Russia, they have allies in China, they have allies elsewhere in the world. And I think that the awareness of where all these problems are coming from is also increasing. So, I think that we'll stay tuned and we'll reach more conclusions over the coming days. And of course, it will be great pleasure to join you and to swap impressions and information.
Can't believe it's only 2 weeks since the nuclear bombers of Russia was attacked, and now we have nuclear reactors of Iran attacked. I mean, the world is really, yeah, as you said, going at a breakneck speed. So, thanks again.
Exactly. Thank you, Glenn. Have a good rest of your Sunday, and until the next time.